Morning, everyone, and thank you for morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining us for this webinar on festivals and social impact. I'm Maria Rosario Jackson. I'm a professor at Arizona State University. And a little bit of background. So this webinar is part of a series produced by the Studio for Creativity, Place, and Equitable Communities at ASU. And it's in collaboration with the Drexel University's Westphal College of Media, Arts, and Design and the Lindy Institute for Urban Innovation. The webinar series focuses on themes from a new publication, the Routledge Handbook on Placemaking, which is available at the Routledge website, and the Studio for Creativity, Place, and Equitable Communities. And all of this work is supported by the Kresge Foundation and by ArtPlace America. We have two panelists that are with us this morning. We have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Maribel Alvarez. Maribel is an anthropologist, a folklorist, a writer, a curator. She's Associate Dean for Community Engagement at the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Arizona, and she holds the Jim Griffith Chair in Public Folklore at the Southwest Center, and is an Associate Research Professor in the School of Anthropology. And Dr. Alvarez is the founder and until recently served as executive director of the Southwest Folklife Alliance, which is an independent nonprofit associated with the University of Arizona. We're also joined by Mr. Bernard Siquieros, who is an enrolled member of the Tohono O'odham Nation. He recently retired as curator of education at the Tohono O'odham Nation's Cultural Center and Museum. He has worked as a counselor, researcher, program coordinator, and education administrator on and off the Tohono O'odham Nation. So welcome to you both. I just want to give a little bit of background on the Routledge Handbook and Maribel's contribution to it. It was really intentional to choose festivals as a topic for this publication, and specifically the evaluation and assessment of the value and impact of festivals, in part because I think they're so often misunderstood. We think of them as an event that happens over a day or several days, often just looking at the bottom line in terms of economic impacts, without really looking at festivals in their fullness, particularly these kind of cultural festivals, which require not only many months of preparation, but many of the things that you'll hear Maribel talk about that have to do with social ties and stewardship of place and cohesion. So we're really excited to take a deeper dive into understanding festivals, and hopefully we'll offer another lens for listeners as you engage in festivals in your own life, and maybe ask some questions about what they mean where you are. So I want to give a little bit of an overview of how we're going to use our time together. We're going to see a video with the intention of bringing you as close to Tucson Meet Yourself, which is the focus of the conversation this morning. And so we're going to show a quick video, and then we're going to hear from Maribel and from Bernard. I'll engage them in some conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So with that, if we can cue up the video.
Bring the ancestors to the table. Their wrinkles are brailed with the roots of those we came from.
Let the children continue our stories. Their laughter reminds us to embrace the joys. Their smiles fills us with hope to move on.
Tradition guide our hands. Weave us into this present moment. Build what we have inherited. Nurture what we dare imagine.
Let our bodies become the song. Dance till ground beneath us joins us in rhythm. Jump till heavens know that we are here.
Taste the world around us. The flavors we grew up become the flavors we share. The meals that heals us becomes the reason we grow.
Celebrate community. Celebrate culture. Celebrate Tucson.
Thank you. And with that, Maribel.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's always a joy to watch that video. It was a gift. That video was a gift given to the festival by Mali, the Multicultural Arts Leadership Program in San Jose, California, who came to pay the visit a year. And this was their service in gifting us with that beautiful recollection. Well, Maria, when you first invited my contribution to the Routledge guide on placemaking, and we talked about festivals, one of the things that was in our mind was the fact that festivals are sort of a strange product in the cultural arts production world. On the one hand, they are very popular. There are more festivals every day, everywhere you look. I love that you taught me this term, Maria. It's one of off-the-shelf products that we immediately pick when we think of community cohesion, when we think of boosting a city's sense of pride. And there's all kinds of festivals. There's street fairs that are very popular. There are pride parades, as we are celebrating now the end of June. This is gay pride parades. There's all kinds of expressions on the streets. And then we focus on Tucson Meet Yourself, which is calls itself a folk life festival. And in this context has a purpose that is more educational than entertaining. Although, as our founder, Big Jim Griffith, and the famous folklorist of the borderlands said, that is just the sugar-coated carrot that we provide for people to learn about each other. And he always jokes and says, imagine if we invited people to come to a lecture for 3 days about cultural diversity and equity, how many will show up? But imagine if we invited them to a festival to eat food and dance and mingle and rub elbows with strangers. And in a lot of ways, the festival, being a folk life educational event, had this idea of bringing forth to a public sphere, to a public view, activities that belong really in the enclave of privacy of many of the ethnic communities that make Tucson. So if you were Polish, you knew about Polish Mass. You knew about Polish food and dancing. If you were Tohono-O'odham, you knew about dances and certain forms of artistry and storytelling. You knew also what time of the year you should tell stories of what kind. But if you were not Tohono-O'odham, you didn't know these things. And yet the Tohono-O'odham were your neighbors. They were the people who lived next door. They were the people you encounter at the store. So a festival as a platform for this sort of like understanding of crisscrossing, of mixing, of making things come together was the original idea of a folk life festival, and letting people represent that in their own terms, in the way that they want to be represented. The Chinese don't have to be told what to represent about being Chinese. They can make that decision and put it on stage and be the curators of their experience, and so forth and so on. Despite that, we have found that understanding how to evaluate a festival has its own conundrums. It's what are the metrics that then account for how a festival is successful? How can an evaluation be honest enough to understand how a differentiated set of values accrues to each of the different participants in an event, from the producers to the city sponsors, to the financial sponsors, to the participants themselves? And we landed on this concept of a distributed benefits model and how to apply that to evaluation. And what we discovered was that when you do that, when you apply a distributed benefits model to the evaluation of an event, you don't focus on the event itself. The event itself is the culmination of a whole bunch of things that happen before and that happen after the event. That a lot of the most important things about a folk life festival like Tucson Meet Yourself actually happen off-site. They don't happen during the 3 days of the event. They happen the other 362 days of the year, and sometimes unseen, because they happen in the communities where these traditions are actually being nourished and cared for. So that the event then becomes a covenant with those communities and that cultural knowledge, where you will agree together to stage that for a public interfacing. And that more ample arc, if you will, of how a festival begins in the relationships, in the consultations that our curator, Leah Maas, engages with Bernard, months before the festival, in the consultations that we begin with the planning of food vendors from different ethnic communities, allows for an expanded sense of value added to the event that is not limited to how many people came and how much money we raise in sponsorships, even though those metrics in some ways are also important. So in the article, I bring up 3 lessons, if you will, that I have learned since my years in Tucson Meet Yourself. As I often joke, when I took over Tucson Meet Yourself was like adopting a 30-year-old into your house for the first time. The festival had already a life, was already grown up as an adult. And I came in to try to do sort of a rethinking of the festival, but had to contend with what it already was. And that's been the last 15 years what I've done. And there are 3 lessons. And one of them implicates Bernard in a way that I will share a little segment from the book and the essay in a minute. The first one is a longitudinal learning. In other words, a learning that extends to a long span and that allows for change. Sometimes what I have learned in the festival as a metric is that the change and the evaluation cannot be contained as to only what happened this year, but like what happened across the years, how a community actually, and we have seen this in some of our ethnic communities. Sometimes they're very strong. Sometimes they get a little bit weaker. Sometimes it's about leadership. Sometimes it's about a challenge. I'll tell you that right now, our Filipino and Asian Pacific community, I already started hearing that they have been disproportionately affected by COVID in this community, because a lot of our Asian Pacific community in Southern Arizona has been involved in healthcare as essential workers. So I'm already beginning to hear that there may be a shift in the possible participation of some of our communities in relationship to how they as a community were affected by COVID, for example. This is a change that can only be ascertained when you're learning about whose value and who counts in the festival has an arc of time, has an arc of a relationship that is built, has a flexibility and an improvisational quality to, if you cannot participate in this way this year, how else would you be involved? How could the festival still honor who are your tradition bearers in other ways that through the year we can include, whether that's recognizing a master artist in your community or whether that is partnering in other sort of events where the festival may not be now the lead, but that had provided the support. We see a lot of this in a lot of events and the small entrepreneurs where they come to the festival to test an idea. And those ideas eventually become a food truck, and a food truck becomes a restaurant, right? But it was tested at Tucson Meet Yourself. So that longitudinal aspect of the learning is the first point. The second one has to do with equitable returns. I spoke of the word covenant. Tucson Meet Yourself brings about 150,000 people together. So people make money at the event. But what are the terms in which the festival organizers engage with folks? Do you pay the artist? Do the artists have an opportunity, being that it's not essentially driven as a street fair for sales, but for demonstrations? Can the artists still feel compensated for the time they take away from work sometimes to demonstrate? from the time that they need to put together to organize a food booth? Is it worth their effort? And how do you establish a platform where the value that accrues is not just goes back as monies that are earned as profit or as surplus by the organizers, but that is actually distributed in tangible ways that makes it worth for the participants to be involved in a tangible material sense, which we know is not the only outcome, but let's face it, it's also part of how you sustain the livelihood of communities that are often on the margins. And the last one has to do with this concept of grounded relationships, the metric of evaluation that measures relationship. And I love to hear the conversation today. How do we do that? How do you measure relationships? One of the ways that relationships in an equitable concept are measured is through humility. And I want to share the experience that we had in 2018, where Bernard was a protagonist of that. In over 45 years, we've never been rained out. The festival had never had rain of any magnitude because we produce it in October in the desert in a time when we don't expect rain at that time. But in 2018, we had 2.5 inches of rain fall on the festival. It was gloomy. We thought the whole thing was coming down. We had equipment, we had 3 stages, we had people, we had food vendors who had brought food and were ready to sell and make their best and most effective fundraiser of the year. And we were consternated. I think I was literally crying in some corner, thinking that what are we gonna do? And as that happened, I write in the essay, one group among all the participants was astonishingly cheerful about the rain. The Tohono O'odham, whose tribal name translates in English to people of the desert, took the disruption in stride. As one of our festival staff members hurried among puddles in the street, she ran into Bernard, who the elder liaison for the Tohono O'odham manual artist. And Bernard, with a smile on his face, told her, "We are happy. We pray for rain in our ceremonial songs. And here it is. A fundamental truth about folk life informed methods of assessment was revealed in that moment. Who gets to define what should count as success?" And that became a turning point for us because we had to say, wait a minute, from our point of view, the festival is going to be a disaster this year. But we have one of our most valued partners here rejoicing about doing demonstrations in the rain. How is that possible? And even though it seems like only a fracture of a moment within the 3 days of activities, it really shifted the way that the staff began to interact. It shifted the way Bernard's message started to get past mouth to mouth. You know, people were saying, "Did you hear what Bernard said? The O'odham are actually happy." And everybody was wearing their ponchos and rain was pouring. And it shifted the way that the festival at that day and that moment began to sort of generate activity. Everybody began to help each other. And we began to see that our lens of understanding success that weekend was actually very skewed to only one particular dimension where we be able to keep our production on our metrics. Whereas for some of our most valued partners, the relationship of humility and learning we had was teaching us that there's a different way of looking at things, that value accrues, again, in differentiated ways to different communities. So I'll stop there because I think that Bernard, I see him eager to add a couple of of that moment when he was the teacher to 150,000 people.
Bernard, welcome to the conversation. We're eager to hear from you.
Thank you. Well, I remember that weekend for sure. But it was a very enjoyable, even though it was wet, an enjoyable weekend for not only me but for the artists that were in attendance. I think the artists in the nation, we have many artists from basket makers to potters to storytellers to singers to dancers, and many of them look forward to participating in this weekend, sharing their culture or sharing our culture with the visitors that come to Tucson Meet Yourself. And so, in fact, sometimes they start calling our office months in advance to make sure that they get on the list to participate in this weekend, because we're limited to a certain number of artists that, because of space, we're limited to a certain number of artists that can actually participate. And so many of our artists call months ahead of time, wanting to make sure that they get on the list to participate. And so the people that were there that weekend were well prepared and welcomed the rain. And as we do, especially right now is our season for that prayer for rain. The saguaro fruit is being harvested now by many families, by individuals, in preparation for that prayer for rain ceremony. And so rain is a big part of our survival, of the survival of the land and the plants and the animals that live on the land. And so it's very special to us. And so that weekend, although it may have been wet and cold, it was a very exciting weekend for us.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those reflections, both of you, Maribel and Bernard. I've been thinking a lot about the role of festivals, and specifically a festival like Tucson Meet Yourself, from my perspective as someone who works in the realms of urban planning and community development. And again, I think that festivals are so often, particularly this kind of festival, misunderstood. And personally, I see the presence of Tucson Meet Yourself as evidence for a lot of other things that are happening in community. To your point, Maribel, you said some of the most important things don't happen during the days of the event or at the event itself at all. And I think about how can a festival like this be understood as a barometer of cultural vitality in a place. And some of the things that you talked about resonate so deeply for me, because I think that healthy communities have to have these opportunities for genuine cultural expression, which the festival provides. And in the course of preparing that festival, there's I think evidence of cultural resilience and the process of cultural resilience that the festival helps to bolster. So I think the question that I have for you has to do with, if you were going to advise a politician or someone in the realm of public life about how to understand the value of having a festival like this in their community, how would you school them? How would you prime them? I mean, we talked about some of the technical things that have to do with distributed impacts and benefits, which is so important, and I think can lead to some real breakthroughs in the evaluation realm. But when you're thinking about helping people understand what this is in a shorthand way, what do you tell them?
Well, Maria, thank you for that super simple question. Maria, I think sometimes one of the things that stands in the way is the word festival. It's kind of strange. Jim Griffith, our founder, he said that for a long time he hesitated calling Tucson Meet Yourself a festival. Because it's really more aligned with the folk life. But then we went with Folk Life Festival because that's what the Smithsonian Folk Life Festival was in 1968. And that's what inspired a lot of the other festivals throughout the country. So we went with festival. But the word stands in the way sometimes. There was a story of a local company. This is a true story, where we had someone helping us with the fundraising and the sponsorships for the event. And mind you that Tucson Meet Yourself for the first 35 years of its existence had no sponsorships whatsoever. There was no commercial. We also don't sell alcohol. So there was just sort of a homegrown event in every sense. And then as things began to change, we started to get bigger and had to provide more support. Well, we had someone go to a local company. I won't name the company, but it's a national brand, and said, we're trying to raise money for Tucson Meet Yourself. And the company said, oh, geez, what is that? Well, it's our annual Folk Life Festival, the namesake festival of the city, Tucson Meet Yourself. And they said, oh, we're so sorry. Our priorities in supporting events is that they do economic development, social cohesion, and multicultural diversity, but we don't support festivals. This is a true story, right? So there was something about the word festival that sounded to somebody in some corporate office as a party, a superfluous thing, some sort of spontaneous, riot of drinking and dancing. By the way, drinking and dancing with strangers on the street is one of my favorite moments at Tucson Meet Yourself, right? It's the moment where democracy becomes plural and horizontal in a way that is just kind of like heartwarming and empowering. But aside from that editorial comment on my part, it really taught me that when we speak about festival, there's a translation work that we have to do, especially festivals like this that are rooted in communities. How do I explain to someone that we have a relationship with Bernard and Tohono O'odham artists that live 2 hours away from Tucson in the nation that goes back 48 years of trust making, and that there is no other experience that actually honors that, and then also at the same time provides economic development opportunities? How do I? So Maria, I think that the job is of translation, and for that we need to understand the audience. Who am I trying to speak to? There would be some politicians, to answer your questions, where I would not bother. Like my kids say, haters are haters, but there are others that are worth sitting to understand. And the job, even though it shouldn't be, is one of translation. And that translation sometimes is hard because it's a language of heart, and it's a language of resistance, and it's a language of cultural pride that is not easy to codify into the structures of urban planners or politicians or corporations. I wonder if Bernard has something else to add to that.
I was just thinking, as curator of education at the Tohono O'odham Nations Cultural Center Museum, I was often asked the question, what do you feel is the most important thing that people need to take away from their visit at the museum? And I would answer that, in looking at our history, there have been many different groups of people that have come in contact with our ancestors and have tried to change our way of life, tried to change our culture. But our culture remains strong. We still have our language, we still have our stories, we still have our traditional values, we still do many of the things that are very much a part of our culture. And so in that way, our culture lives, our culture survives. And people are today are very interested in sharing that culture through festivals like Tucson Meet Yourself or other events where they're invited to come and share that culture, because it's a culture that brings a lot of pride to those individuals. So Tucson Meet Yourself has done quite a bit in recognizing the Tohono O'odham, from the very beginning. I remember attending Tucson Meet Yourself as not as a participant, but as someone that likes to eat the various different kinds of foods that were provided. But I took pride in seeing some of our traditional dancers that were on stage sharing the culture. Some of the musicians that were playing at the time, sharing their talent with the community. it was later on when we opened the museum that we got a little more involved, but I guess we can talk about that a little later on.
Thank you for that. Well, Bernard, why don't you tell us a little bit about how the museum was involved? Go ahead.
Well, when the museum was opened in 2007, it provided a place where people can actually call to inquire about various things, inquire about the culture, visit the museum, learn about our history and our culture. Part of the mission for the museum was to support and encourage the arts among our members. And so we began to develop a artist directory. I'm sure we didn't get everyone, but we had a list of individuals who were painters, jewelry makers, basket makers, potters, singers, dancers, storytellers, the whole gamut. But in the late or shortly after we opened, we were contacted by a representative from Tucson Meet Yourself, who encouraged us to work with them, or asked us if we would work with them in providing providing artists from the nation who would come to what they termed the Autumn Pavilion, Artist Pavilion. And so we immediately began to work with this representative and started calling artists that we knew, and we very quickly met our quota as to the number of artists that we had space for. And so the artists came, and we're very appreciative at the fact that Tucson Meet Yourself, realizing that many of these artists had to come a long ways to Tucson to share their culture, provided rooms for many of the artists. We had artists that lived in Tucson that didn't need rooms, but we had a lot of artists from the nation who needed a place to stay for that weekend. And so it was a fun weekend. And so I think word spread from that first encounter with Tucson Meet Yourself that we've been very successful in getting the number of artists that we need to fill the pavilion. Well, it's interesting. Limited us to, first I think it was like 15, that grew to 20, and then but what I noticed is that when we had the number of artists that we needed, we were full. We had the max, and all the tables were full, and the artists were there sharing, talking with people that were walking by, and a couple of times we had local artists that just came. I remember one artist who came, and he had a backpack, and he says, I didn't know that you guys were going to be here. He says, do you think I can put out my baskets? He says, I make baskets. And so one of the ladies that was sitting nearby heard him, and she says, here, sit right here. I'll move my stuff over. She moved her stuff over, and he put his baskets there. And lo and behold, by the end of the day, he sold out. He sold out. So he said he was going to go home, and he said he's been working on a large basket. He's going to spend all night trying to finish it. And so the next day, sure enough, he brought it back, and that was the only basket he had, and he sold that. And then so it was real good for him. But it just showed that helpfulness among one another that took place at that time. Artists would often trade some of their work with other artists there. They would, when they would come, they would often walk around the pavilion and see something that they wanted, and toward the end of the festival, they would trade an item of theirs for an item that they wanted. And so there was that type of relationship that was built among the artists, and I think the artists prepared. We're getting ready, realizing that this is an important festival for them, that they would prepare throughout the year, making sure that they had the right enough material to make the things that they needed for the festival. And so it wasn't just a weekend, it was preparing throughout the throughout the year.
Yeah, thank you for offering that window, because
Sure.
it really does, I think, help to illustrate something Maribel said, which is the need to look at the impacts of, I won't call it an event, but the impacts of an initiative like this,
Right.
not just in even a year, but beyond,
Right.
because it does
Right.
have this temporal dimension that goes beyond what people may immediately think about. One of the things that I really appreciate about your work, Maribel, and Bernard, you and others who help to elevate and give life to initiatives like Tucson Meet Yourself is how it contributes to what I think of as cultural vitality. So as a planner, one of the things that I've done from a lot of my career is think about cultural vitality as a critical element of a healthy place to live. And I think that an initiative like Tucson Meet Yourself in some ways becomes a vessel that captures so many different elements of cultural vitality. And one of the elements of cultural vitality that I don't think we talk about or are good stewards of as we think about creating healthy places to live, and it is curiosity. And I am curious about how Tucson Meet Yourself advances a healthy curiosity among the diversity of people from Tucson. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, that's one of our fundamental values as a folk life festival. There is sometimes a confusion in the sense that the event, like Tucson Meet Yourself, and the name says it, is a hyper local event. So in that sense, it's sometimes at odds with sources of funding for community development, for example, that are focused on primarily the attraction of tourists. There is a sense of how do we know that people are going to come who are from outside, which is a driver for hotel tax in many ways in many cities. That's how the arts are funded. So I've been in rooms where the conversations turn interesting to an event of high value of Tucson Meet Yourself actually being sometimes undervalued because of its hyperlocal content. And thank God that we're big enough now that we have documented the impact in multiple ways. But this hyperlocal aspect connects to the question of curiosity, because placemaking at the end of the day has to do with the understanding of the place where you live in a way that is dynamic and intersectional, that you are connected to other people in being stewards of this place. This is a very difficult concept for us here in the Southwest. Some of the neighbors we get have no understanding of the water, the history of water and the use of water. They come from another place and they come to be our neighbors, but yet at the same time, there's very little understanding of where the food grows, what are the needs, how are the plants sustained and the larger environment. So how does a festival, even in this hyper-local context, which is not about attracting tourists to come to your city, essentially that's not the driver, how do you foster a sense of curiosity about each other in a way that is respectful and understands the protocols of cultural behaviors that allow you to interact, or like I always say, play in somebody else's playground. One of the ways in which this is really interesting in the Tohono O'odham experience is that when Waila music, and Waila music is the music of the Tohono O'odham, is a social dance music. It's, by the way, very rarely is it even sung. It's just instrumental dance music, right? And there is a circle that you form, and that you begin to dance counterclockwise in a circle to the music. And like in many other traditions, and you have seen this in powwows and in other forms, you see it also in other European traditions of folk music and dance. But at that moment, when people are invited to join in the dance, you begin to see the community of Tohono O'odham themselves teaching members of the community that is not of Tohono O'odham, how is it that you behave culturally appropriate when you are in the setting of sharing culture? And so the curiosity becomes a curiosity about negotiating methods of interaction that are not extractive, that are not offensive, that are not appropriative, but that actually allowed room for cultural sharing in a way that is equitable. The Yaquis do the same when they have their deer dance ceremony blessing. By the way, they never allow me to call it a performance. That's why we do it at the end of the day of Sunday, because it's a blessing offer to the community. The only non-ceremonial tribal space where the tribe allows and sanctions that the deer dance and Pascola dance happens. And people are told, don't take photographs or sit here. And a lot of community members, for the first time, are understanding the Yaquis are more than the casino, you know, that there's a kind of ceremonial life and a gifting to the community. And that's curiosity. How do I relate to you, my neighbor, in a way that allows me to understand that I can be in your company, that you can be in my home, I can visit your spaces and do it in a way that doesn't become a crass commercial exploitation extraction process. We hope that we have done something in Tucson to change the metabolism of how the city does some of these transactions. And it's always a work that has to be repeatedly done. You cannot say, oh, we've done it for 48 years and now we just turn Tucson into a, a perfect, no, it's about, and one of the ways that that has happened is hosting mini festivals within the festival. So for example, a few years ago, we did something that is very timely about African-American music. We had a festival within Tucson Meet Yourself called Meet Your Soul, Tucson Meet Your Soul. There was all a curation of gospel music and soul music within the event, so that communities themselves become the teachers and they open the platform. That's curiosity.
It's such a beautiful example of, I think, curiosity with respect and humility, as well as evidence of, cultural self-determination, right? And how is it that people decide that they want to show up in this collective space? So thank you for that. There's a question in the our Q&A, and I encourage participants to please ask your questions in the Q&A. Amanda Rincon is interested in storytelling and has experience with storytelling as a particularly impactful way of making connections. And she's asking about spaces set up for storytelling at Tucson Meet Yourself. Can you speak a little bit to that?
In some years, we've been very intentional and have curated storytelling. The one year in particular had, and occasionally at different times. A lot of it has to do with the curators and sort of how they're working and what communities are working. I think the storytelling is fabulous. One year we staged a film for the deaf community that was about deaf communities and expressions of music and poetry. One year we staged something, we brought someone from Trinidad and did that carnival of Trinidad mini carnival on the street. So there's different variations that happen, and storytelling has been part of the event, and it's occasionally it's not one of the dedicated tracks necessarily that we do. It appears in other ways through our work throughout the year.
Thank you for that, Maribel. Bernard, any thoughts about storytelling on your end?
Maribel mentioned earlier that in our culture, stories, especially stories related to creation, are meant to be told only during the winter months. And so, Tucson Meet Yourself is usually held in October. And so that's not a time where we would actually be sharing stories. And so we've been asked if we would participate in the storytelling uh, program, but again, we've just not been able to do that because those types of stories are not meant to be told during that time of the year.
At the same time, Maria, it just occurred to me that in our stage called the Culture Kitchen, is all about storytelling of recipes and of folks who came and developed their own food traditions. It is a speaking stage in that sense. It is the cooking and demonstration stage, but it's where more storytelling happens sometimes than in other parts of the festival as folks come and share.
Yes, go ahead.
Could I just add a little something? I wanted to go back to that
Yeah.
the talk on curiosity. You know, it's interesting to watch the artists, especially the basket makers, when people will come and they'll watch basket makers making their baskets, and the most frequently asked question is, how long does it take you to finish a basket? And there is no set time. It just depends on how much time an individual can devote to working on their basket. But it provides an opening for their artists to begin to talk about their work, their design, their collection of materials, preparing of materials, raising their family, being in the community. So it's that curiosity that gets people start to talk about their culture and their lives. So it's real important. I just wanted to mention that earlier when we were talking about curiosity.
Maria and I, now that you asked the question, a lot of other things came to mind. And maybe it's because we answer storytelling too narrow. It like, as a matter of fact, I'm going to put here in the chat that we have a program. I don't know if maybe called Faces of the Festival, where it's all about storytelling of who attends. For several years, we've done this a photo booth, where we take these amazing portraits of community members, this what I call the sea of humanity. And this becomes an archival record. And I think it has to do with one of the questions about how the festival, we are able to then understand, and we hire student and volunteer ethnographers to do micro interviews on site of people's relationship to their arrival in Tucson, to their longevity in Tucson, to their relationship to their own cultural traditions. So there's all kinds of storytellings as practice embedded into the creation and the crafting of the event in ways that I think I myself got myself short of answering that question more amply when you asked it.
Well, your comment now certainly relates to Kurt Dewhurst's question about archival processes and documentation. There's a question about how that happens. Can you speak to the role of documentation at the festival? And how does that benefit the community?
For the first 30 years, the festival was heavily archived, and a lot of those recordings of musical performances are now in the special collections at the University of Arizona, Tucson Meet Yourself folklore. In fact, when the festival turned 40, there was a special collections exhibit that showcased all of the ways in which the festival had been archived and documented. And that includes the notes for the first Tucson Meet Yourself ever, the production notes, the list of the budget, the budget for the first Tucson Meet Yourself in 1974. All of those things have been archived. In more recent years with digital technology, there's a kind of populist archiving as well that happens on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and you type Tucson Meet Yourself, you see the immense amount of self-recording that people have done in the digital space. And we understand in an evaluation context some archival information as part of how we also ask questions in the way that we evaluate. I mentioned in the article that one year we were bold enough, I think we just sort of went for it, And one of our evaluation questions, we've done a lot of survey on site, over 5,000, where people are waiting in line for their food. So we've had a lot of students approach them with the questionnaire. And one of the question is, how is Tucson Meet Yourself different from other festivals? We actually asked people what they thought about that. And to our surprise, 65% of the people, without us prompting them, said, oh, what do you mean? It's an educational event. And we were like, oh my God, really? You get that? Did you really get it? That it's educational? we were happy to confirm that the intention was there. Another year, there was a sense that, are we preaching to the choir? Are we really increasing cultural equity and inclusion? Because the people who come are already primed to support that, right? And we said, well, do we or not? So over 5 years, we tested our audience and discovered that there was about a 30% of new audience for the first time. That gave our curators the opportunity to use those numbers to say, hey, by the way, there's about 30% of people who will be exposed to Tucson Meet Yourself for the first time. And that allowed the curators to think of imaginative ways in which they can engage community members. In 2019, this happened with Leah Mas, who's our curator of folk art. She works very closely with Bernard, and she's the director of the Southwest Folklife Alliance. And Leah said to me, she was going to do an exhibit of a traditional altar. She was going to bring some artisans from LA to create the most magnificent altar. And she was going to do it inside, in a space inside, not on the street. And I was hesitant. I said, I don't know, Leah. I don't know that people who come to an outdoor festivals are going to want to go inside to an exhibit. We've done exhibits that have been successful, but they are under a tent in a public setting. Leah said, well, I feel this deserves this, and I'm going to partner with the End of Life Coalition, and we're going to do some final life directives, and we're going to do some education. Well, lo and behold, over the 3 days weekend, we had 6,000 people come. You know, and over 400 End of Life directives, petitions were sort of filed and recorded. And I mean, it was one of those things where you have to also trust that the curators are doing the work before the festival and after in sustaining their relationships to sort of understand the feel of what is relevant in the community.
There's one question that maybe bridges to this, and it's Selena Morales has asked about public practice, and do the curators consider public practice as a way to support community cultural needs in the face of change, recognizing that there may be some practices that are traditional but don't happen in the home anymore. Can you speak to that really briefly, because I know we're coming up on time?
Yeah, that is really interesting. We're contending this year, Selena, with that idea. In fact, with the collective mourning of COVID, we're going to make a space in the festival. There's been over 2,000 deaths of COVID in Pima County. So we are going to offer a space for mourning and grief and memory. And we're going to try to do that collectively in a safe way, now that we have received the okay from the county to gather again in October. We may still be cautious. We're not sure yet what will that imply in terms of other regulations around health care. But we're thinking about how does the private and the public interact. The same is true in reverse. We understand that there are things at the festival that they're very culturally important to communities that are not festival material, are not the stuff that you will bring to the festival. There are moments in Tohono O'odham life that we're not going to bring to the public. That's because that's just not the proper interpretation context for that.
Thank you so much for all of these insights. I know we're almost at time. And Bernard, thank you so much for your reflections, and Maribel for your reflections and your continued elaboration of concepts in the book chapter you wrote. I just want to say that if you're interested in participating in Tucson Meet Yourself, it's in October 8 through 10, correct?
8 through 10 this year, yes.
Awesome. And then we'll be hosting another webinar that's going to be focused on evaluation possibilities and challenges in culturally based community development efforts. So we'll riff on some of these ideas, but we'll actually be talking about a community development context and specifically cultural based community development. In October, Drexel University will be hosting a 2-day design research symposium in Philadelphia that asks about principles of placemaking and placekeeping and co-design. This is all connected to everything that we're doing together here. If you're interested in sharing this with anyone, there will be a recording available. It'll be sent out later to everyone who registered. And I think with that, we're done. And thank you again, Chris Park. Thank you so much for all of your technical support. And hopefully we'll see you again at the next webinar, or maybe even in Philadelphia. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Maria.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Christina.
Thank you.